Crossing Boundaries. It's the name of today's message because in Jesus' mission, this is what John presents to us as his next priority. We've been thinking a lot about how Jesus relates to the religious insiders and the kind of in-groups at the time, but how does he then take the message out beyond that group? It's not really that long since in the West we've crossed massive boundaries which have led to greater inclusion and more people taking part in society. Recently came across the story of Charlene Hunter. She was a young girl growing up in the late 1950s in the South in America, and she wanted to go to state college, but she was approached by the civic black leaders at the time, those fighting for civil rights, to try and actually apply to university to test and challenge the system of segregation. And so she did that, and she was continually knocked back on the basis that there was no room in the accommodation. And so she kept challenging it, and eventually, after a 2-year legal battle, she was admitted to the first ever black female to the University of Georgia. She wanted to be a journalist. And on her first day, to be able to go up and register to classes, she had to cross something much more hostile than a picket line, honestly a mob of folks hurling racist abuse, epithets, and insults. And it would have been the easiest thing in the world for her to turn back and to conclude that that wasn't just worth it. But whenever she related the incident, she would talk about the fact that she was not doing that just for her own academic career or credentials or even personal sense of achievement. She was aware in crossing through that and crossing that boundary that she was doing something momentous and historic that would hopefully lead to more freedom and equality for many more people than just her. And it did. And that feels like perhaps a long time ago, but we still have a way to go, and we still have questions today about those of us in the church and those of us who look to carry God's gospel. What boundaries does it need to cross? What are the boundaries that perhaps Jesus would cross today? And I hope that we'll be able to go through some of that together by looking at the ones he crosses in this passage. Now, the Samaritan woman is a story I'm sure many of you are familiar with and know well. And I'm sure you get the basic contours of it, but it's always helpful to put into it the background of the world Jesus is living in, because for me anyway, the story leaps off the page a bit more when you understand what the cultural surroundings are. Samaria is an area to the north of what was thought of as Judea in this time, and it's basically the rump of the old kingdom of Israel. You'll remember that through the kingdom of Israel in the Old Testament, it eventually becomes split in two. And you've got Judah to the south and Israel to the north. And from the time of King Ahab in the north, there began to be deportations. They became a military colony, if you like, and they started to be carried off to other nations. And what happened then was the people left behind, the Israelite people who were left behind, began to marry and interpopulate with folks that were not from Israel. And so what happened was, in terms of the way Israel, or just Samaria to the north as it became known, was viewed by others, was that it was impure, that it was a location of half-breeds where the bloodline, if you like, of Israel had been mixed, but also their worship and their ritual purity had been mixed, because folks had come in with different and false gods, and that was seen as sacrilegious. And so everyone who was in Judah looked up to the north and thought, those are the half-breeds. They're not the real deal. They are ritually and spiritually and culturally impure and unclean. And so that's the setting that this takes place in. And into that situation, we also have the status of women at the time, whose legal testimony was not admissible in court. And we also have then a divide, a strict one, between men and women. And so we've got culture, we've got geography, we've got the social conditions of the time. And all of these things are live issues, they're present, they're controversial, And it's those boundaries that Jesus chooses to cross. Why? To what possible good and effect? So I want to look at the geographical boundary he crosses, the religious or ritual boundary he crosses, and the cultural boundary he crosses. Geographical. Now, Jesus had been performing his ministry, people had been getting baptized, and he learned that the Pharisees heard he was gaining, baptizing more disciples than John. So he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. So Galilee's in the very far north. Now he had to go through this area, territory that was known as Samaria. Now in verse 4 it says, now he had to go through. And commentators are sort of divided over whether they think that means geographically. That was the only way. But it wasn't the only way. We know of at least 2 or 3 routes, and some of them that kind of went around and circumvented Samaria. So I think that he had to go through is more likely in the next chapter of Jesus' mission to people. This is what had to happen, which I hope will become clear. Now he had to go through Samaria. So he came to this town called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. So interestingly, this whole place has a shared history. The Jewish and the Israelite people are, like they say often about us and Americans, 2 people separated by a common language. They're 2 people with a similar history, but the Jews didn't think that the Samaritans had any claim to Jacob whatsoever. Now, the Samaritans obviously think that they did. So you can see the sort of sectarian tension that's there. And Jesus travels to go up and directly through this territory that's divided by this kind of tension and hostility. We know from historical records that this just wasn't just a bit of side eye and some muttering and under-the-breath comments. We know that quite often Jews would come down. There was a lot of Jews in Galilee, further north, so they would come down through Samaria for pilgrimage around the time of the Passover, and it would actually lead to violent clashes at the time. I hope that I don't have to elucidate too much the fact that the world you and I are living in and being in the UK and what we've seen on our news screens in the last week, that these are problems that have not entirely gone away. And so the situation Jesus is coming into is actually quite easy for us to picture. There are certain no-go areas for certain people. I remember when I was working in television, I was doing a program up in the sticks in North Uist, and myself and the cameraman, we were deciding that we were staying in a hotel, deciding that we wanted a change of scenery one night, so we would go down to another local establishment to see if we could get a drink, something to eat, and just change the scenery a bit. So we did that, and we walked in. Now, my cameraman was from Northern Ireland, and we walked in, and we saw memorabilia of a certain football team from Glasgow, absolutely everywhere. And there was only 2 or 3 people at the bar, and you could have heard a pin drop when we walked in. And I thought, all right, this is not exactly what I'd planned on. So we walked up and we proceeded to ask for a menu and order a drink, and they turned and they said, where are you from? And he said in his very thick Northern Irish accent, I'm from Derry. And they said, you mean Londonderry? And he said, no, I'm quite sure I mean Derry. And it's that way of, you could just feel the tension in the room. Anyway, they told us we were in the wrong place. And we finished up our drink and left very, very, very quickly because I wanted to be able to continue making the TV program. And so, it's the sort of places, had I known that and being with James and so on, I would never have gone there. Because it's our natural inclination to avoid geography where we think we might not be welcome, where there are possible inbuilt prejudices and sectarian tensions and so on. And so I would never have gone there. But Jesus chooses to cross this geographical boundary because he has got something that he wants to do. He wants to expand the mission of God to people that are being left out of it just now. The Samaritans are absolutely despised by the Jews. It's completely sectarian. They're looked down on. And he decides, I'm going to go there. And what's the relevance of that for us in the church? Well, where we sit in the church, I don't think we actively despise outsiders, certainly not in Erskine Parish Church. But the church more broadly is now something that we are in and we're institutionalized in, and we're pretty comfortable. And I love the challenge of Jesus' ministry and mission is to go into places where we might not be in the majority and where we might be a bit uncomfortable and where people, I'm reminded of this whenever I do the football chaplaincy. Whenever I'm around the football players, they don't use the same language that people in church do. But I'm there because I want to represent the fact that we actually care about things outside the boundaries. And maybe for us, maybe that's just being willing to let God challenge us and to let us be salt and light in places that perhaps ordinarily we wouldn't have maybe thought of going. But this is controversial. Jesus just going there and deliberately spending time there probably isn't looked on favorably for him, but he's so committed to the mission that his Father has given him. And as we're going to see, he particularly wants the Samaritan people to see that there is a day coming where they're going to feel just as much like they have a seat at the table. But that involves him going into territory that traditionally wouldn't have been seen as the place that he should be. He crosses a geographical boundary, and then he crosses a big religious and ritual boundary. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, verse 7, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" Because his disciples had gone into the town to buy food. Now, we get a hint at how scandalous this is, and the Samaritan woman's reply when she says, "You are a Jew and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans." And that's just putting it mildly. The whole religion of Judaism at this time is based on ritual purity and the extent to which you are clean or unclean, determining how close you can possibly become to God. And the challenge here is that a Samaritan, by definition, is going to be unclean. Half-breeds, they've mixed with other gods and other people. A Samaritan woman is then going to be especially unclean because she has much less social status. By extension, a Samaritan woman's vessels, whatever she uses to gather and draw water, in this time is going to be seen as completely undrinkable and unusable by a Jewish person, because what they're going to do in the eyes of God and the law, according to their faith at the time, is they're going to be soiling themselves. They're going to be making themselves impure and unclean and distasteful to God by having a drink from what she has had. Okay? It's similar to if we think about the AIDS crisis in the 80s, people would smash the utensils that people with AIDS had used because they were so fearful of catching something. So the divide is real because they want to stay close to God. So you can say at least there's somewhat of an admirable motive to it. And Jesus decides to cut through that. Why? Because it's important for him to put himself, if you like, in this woman's debt to show, I need a drink of water and it's not actually going to bother me that you give it to me. She would have never have had a Jew ask her for a drink of water before, which Jesus is. Jesus is a racial and ethnic Jew at the time. She would never have had that, and then she would never have been able to serve a Jewish person and to actually give them a drink of water. And she would never have been able to have that sense of equality, that they could share a cup. We talk about at communion time the importance of sharing the cup and being in that together, because that shows that we're in fellowship and we all have the same connection to God. It would never have happened. And this is all because of the question of who is welcome at the table of God. Who is it really for? Who is the gospel really for? That's what it's all about. And they are the outcasts at the time. They are the people just on the bottom of the ladder. They are the rubbish on the bottom of the people's shoes. And nobody thinks that they have any legitimate claim to the faith of God's people. And yet here is Jesus bringing her in and including her. And that is powerful in its time, and as we'll see later, that actually leads to something transformative. She becomes a great witness and a great herald of the gospel in her area. But it led me to think, in terms of application, what are the religious taboos and boundaries that, if we think about Jesus today and Jesus working with us as the church through his hands and his feet, what are the what are the religious lines that can be crossed? Even the ones that are perhaps damaging, because I can't stress this enough, none of this is a good look for Jesus. Good look for the time and the day that he's living in. It's risky. I think there's so much to be celebrated about what we've done here. We were faced in the church here with the news that our local area was going to be housing asylum seekers in the last year, and we were not worried about what that would look, because we were determined to show, our theology was that the grace and love of God has come to us, and we want to show it to those who need it. And it was beautiful to see, and I think that I ought to continually remind us and encourage us that we know something of this. We know what it is, even in the face of hostility, to cross boundaries. But there's still more to do. I was thinking about this week, who are those people who would perhaps feel like religious outsiders, like they don't belong at the table because of how they've been made to feel. And I don't think specifically by us, but certainly by the church, the Big C church worldwide. And my inbox is personally full. And by full, I mean, I'm not going to exaggerate. It's not hundreds, but it's definitely dozens of messages from folks who grew up in the church in an affiliation with Christianity, and they don't feel like they're able to come or to worship because they're gay. And many of you will have family members, and I have family members who are gay, and they don't feel like they have a place in the church still. Now, I know we've come a long way, and there is relative equality before the law, but in terms of being able to take part in the religious life, and often those folks are seeking God, and they just don't feel like they could come and they would be made welcome. And I think our culture wars just now, that if we watch too much of the news, that we get drawn into is thinking this is a zero-sum game. There's, the LGBT folks want to destroy society as we know it, and then there's a hard stand of people against that. And I don't think that we have to buy into that, because, and this is something I remember speaking to our session about probably a couple of years ago, is that I've continually been challenged to think, do we really mean the fact that all are welcome? And if they are, how can we show and extend that? Because all we're looking to do is extend the welcome that we would extend to anybody, and make sure that actually means anybody. And that can be a challenge. And sometimes that means we need to do a bit more work of crossing boundaries and reaching people who feel like they have been hurt and excluded because of this. But when I see the work of Jesus and the fact that he's willing to cross such big taboo religious things at the time, and they do enter into a theological discussion, but where it ends up is the fact that there's going to be an irrelevance about where you started and your ethnic thing, and the things that you can't change about yourself, because what is coming is a day where God is simply looking for the response and the worship of the heart. And that's what when I'm asked about it, I try to say to gay folks today, is that they're welcome the same way I am welcome, that God isn't looking at my predetermined characteristics to see whether I'm worthy of receiving the gospel or not. And it's a challenge I'm continually giving myself of how can I continue to extend this message beyond borders. I sometimes end up in conversations with folks who are Wiccan or New Age spiritualists, and they say, would I be welcome in church, and can you even talk to me? And I say, yes, of course. I don't exactly know how it would look, but I continue to hold to this radical conviction that the gospel and the invitation of it is genuinely for everyone. And it's up to me and my brothers and sisters in the church and in Christ to continue to figure out how we make space for folks, so that when we say you are welcome and you can taste of and enjoy the grace of God, regardless of your current practices or spirituality or lack thereof, or sexuality, or even your strong mental health issues, that when we look at the life of Jesus, he is willing to say, none of those things make you so impure that you can't encounter the touch of God and experience his grace and love. Because, let's face it, as we were thinking about last week, the thing Nicodemus didn't get is that you can't drum yourself up into being accepted by God anyway. He just does it. And all of us came in to an acceptance and an appreciation of God's love for us the way we were born into the world. We did it through God's agency and God showering us with his grace and his goodness and his love. And it had so little to do with us. And I think it's our job to pull down religious and ritual barriers and to say the space that we hold is in line with Jesus' ministry is for everyone. Because he crosses the geographic boundaries and will go right into the heart of a sectarian mess in order to have a conversation with one woman and show she's accepted. And he'll go right through the strong religious parameters that keep people from associating with one another and sharing fellowship and a cup and a table. And he'll say, actually, we belong at the same table. And this is where the gospel is going. And finally, he goes through massive cultural barriers in order to do this. Now, I would just want to draw out a few beginnings of verses to illustrate this. The Samaritan woman said to him, verse 9, Jesus answered her. Sir, the woman said, verse 11. Jesus answered her, verse 13. The woman said to him, verse 15. Jesus said to her, verse 17. Sir, the woman said, verse 19. Verse 21, Jesus replied. The reason I'm doing that is because he had a conversation with her. Now, the world that Jesus is in, not only are women second-class citizens, they're seen as inherently dangerous. To have as a male an extended conversation with a woman who is not your relative was seen as highly suspect, dangerous, and not right. As you know, famously, this woman has had 5 husbands, and Jesus draws out that pain point in her life. Now, most of the times I've heard this interpreted as, 5 husbands, yeah, we all know that kind of woman, do you know? But she could have been widowed. Or, I actually think, given everything we know about the social world at the time, possibly she got passed around at the agency of men without being able to really advocate for herself much. We don't actually know, but I think it's just as wrong to suppose one of those things over the other. But I'd lean, given Jesus' grace to her, I would lean more on the charitable side towards her, and particularly given the power imbalance at the time. I don't think she has a lot of agency or say. Or, you know how difficult it was? Even if she had been widowed 5 times, do you know the way she would have been viewed in society? My goodness, what did she do to get that much punishment from God? There must be something really wrong with her. She's out at the well in the middle of the day, at midday, at the baking heat, when everyone else had gone out in the morning, because she doesn't want, likely, the shame of being around other people. So she's doing it on her own, and usually women are doing that collectively and together. So she's culturally dangerous, bad news. And Jesus sits down and talks to her for an extended period of time, and he communicates that he doesn't really care what the culture around him has to say about men and women and the way it looks, and particularly how dangerous women apparently are. Because do you know what she goes away from this conversation and does? She goes and spreads the gospel. A woman whose testimony is supposed to be nothing. But, verse 31, it says that many believed who were Samaritans because of the woman's testimony. And Jesus picked her to be the evangelist and the ambassador of the gospel. And he risked the fact that everyone would have thought he was sitting down with some kind of harlot in order to do that. And he wasn't bothered. And, you know, I think this is a really good shake-up, because there's a lot of, there was famously a thing called the Billy Graham rule. Billy Graham, powerful evangelist, many people converted through his ministry. But he had this rule that he would never be alone with a woman who wasn't his wife, like, at all. And some kind of parts of evangelical Christianity still hold to that and have rigid gender roles for men and women, and it becomes almost absurd, the hoops you have to jump through to make sure. And at the heart of it is this continuing idea, I would say, is that, oh, well, it's women that are dangerous, despite the fact that statistically it's men who are a danger to women, really, when we look at crime and violent assault and so on. But it's this idea, projection of the women are dangerous, and he says, no, they're not. And no, it's not dangerous to be seen with one, because if I'll sit and I'll talk with a man without anyone there, then I'll sit and talk with a woman without anyone there, because Genesis 1:26, God made them in his own image, male and female. After his own image, he made both of them. There's something about being male and female equally that communicate the dignity, the worth, and the beauty of what it is to be made in God's image. And so that is worth the same treatment. So it's radical and it's taboo. It's a huge cultural boundary that Jesus decides to smash and to not be bothered about. And I think the continuing mission of the church is perhaps going to have to be a bit edgy and not really bothered about perhaps how sometimes irreverent things might look or seem. And that'll be different from one context to another. But all of it is worth it to see the gospel continue to flourish, as long as we know our motives, that we want to continue to follow Jesus and his way of communicating and taking the gospel to more and more people. Then we know we're on good ground, and we know that even if we take some heat for it, that it's worth it, because we have that sense of conviction in what we're doing, and the power and the beauty of the gospel being of more import than what people might say, which is a tension that we're always living with. But ultimately, I'm encouraged by the fact that this works. That we start this story with so many people represented: Samaritans, outcasts, half-breeds, women, social outcasts, folks who are looked down on, folks who are seen as having no place at the table in church and in Christianity. And through this story and this woman's encounter with Jesus, they're all brought in, and it's communicated to all of them. This is where you belong. That there is no boundary and barrier that the gospel and Jesus' message of his good news is unable to cross. And we, by his divine favor and grace, are continuing to live in the wake of that, and we are continually being asked to look for the boundaries and the barriers that are yet to be crossed, because there's still people that need to know that this characteristic, that characteristic, none of these things hold you back. God is looking for worshippers, as Jesus says to her, who worship in spirit and in truth. Those that look and see the beauty and the claims that Jesus makes about the fact that he's the Messiah, and who respond with open spirits, who are looking for that love that he has to give, and who are willing to respond. And that is the only qualification. May God bless his word to us this morning. Amen.